But what strikes me the most, other than the rolling frog balls, the beavers that stand on two legs with no tails and have homes with fire, and, man bat, what strikes me is about how detailed the whole thing is. Welcome to A Popular History of Unpopular Things, a podcast that covers the unpopular stories from history. Tales about disease, death, and destruction. I like learning about all things bloody, gross, mysterious, and weird. In August 1835, British astronomer Sir John Herschel shocked the world with a discovery that could change the way we understand life as we know it. He had proof that there was life on the moon. Now, I don't think you need me to tell you that, of course, this is categorically false, right? There's not life on the moon, at least not in the way that Herschel apparently described it. He said that he saw fantastical beings and mammals with wings living in huge forests on beaches and oceans, flying around in the skies, building houses and temples, engaging in social life within their own little civilization. But at the time, the story was an absolute sensation for The Sun, a New York-based newspaper that ran from 1833 to 1950 and later merged with the New York World Telegram. It's not the same Sun that exists today. The New York Sun, it's not that publication. So in today's episode, we're going to take a look at that story. We'll begin, not with historical context this time, we'll begin with a summary of the original series of articles and then try to understand where it came from. Why did a famed astronomer make these claims? Why did it come out in 1835? How did the population take it at the time? And when did they realize that it was actually just fiction? And what does the Great Moon Hoax tell us now about life in the early to mid-19th century, that's the 1800s? Because at the end of the day, we know it's just a story, but why was it published in a newspaper as if it were fact? What was the point of it? So let's dive into this weird world of fantastical nonsense and hoaxes and place it into its historical context. What can the Great Moon Hoax of 1835 tell us about the history of the 19th century, science, and print culture? So let's get started. Now, unlike most episodes where I start with the historical context, today I want to start the episode with the story itself. So let's get introduced to this the way that people did back in 1835, by reading, or in your case listening, to the tale. I'm going to present it as a narrative blending some of the original source material with my own writing to help it flow. It was a 6-day serial account, and it is quite long. I've attached a link to the original content in the description of my podcast, so check it out if you're interested in reading it in its entirety. I've omitted entire sections that are essentially just exposition not necessary to the overall story of the episode. Things that just serve to make the newspaper serial seem more scholarly and therefore real, like a lot of information about the size and construction of the telescope itself or where it's located. Like, we don't need that information. But anyway, let's begin. There have been recent discoveries in astronomy which will make the human race proud. By means of a telescope of vast dimensions, Sir John Herschel, at his observatory in the southern hemisphere, has made the most extraordinary discovery. He has obtained a distinct view of objects on the moon and has settled the question of whether the moon is inhabited. It was about 9:30 when Herschel and his colleague Dr. Grant turned his telescope to the eastern side of the moon. He could see a beautifully distinct and even vivid representation of basaltic rock. Its color was a greenish-brown, with columns that appeared to be hexagonal. However, they were covered with a dark red flower, similar to the rose poppy. It was the first organic production of nature in a foreign world ever revealed to the eyes of men. The specimen of lunar vegetation had raised another question. It had demonstrated that the moon had an atmosphere similar to our own, and capable of sustaining organized, and therefore, most probably, animal life. Past the basalt rocks, they saw a forest. The trees, says Dr. Grant, for a period of 10 minutes, were one of unvaried kind, and unlike any I have seen, except for the largest kind of yews in the English churchyards, which they in some respects resemble. These were followed by a level green plain, which, as measured by the painted circle on our canvas of 49 feet, must have been more than half a mile in breadth, and then appeared as fine a forest on firs, unequivocal firs, as I have ever seen cherished in the bosom of my native mountains. Beyond the forest was a lake, or an inland sea. The shoreline had a beach of white sand, punctuated with wild, castellated rocks, apparently of green marble, varied at chasms, occurring every 200 or 300 feet, with grotesque blocks of chalk or gypsum, and feathered and festooned at the summit with the clustering foliage of unknown trees. The water, we obtained a view of it, was nearly as blue as that of the deep ocean, and broke in large white billows upon the strand. The action of very high tides was quite manifest upon the face of the cliffs for more than 100 miles. Yet diversified as the scenery was during this and at a much greater distance, we perceived yet no trace of animal existence. We turned our telescope to the valleys, where we saw quartz spires varying in height from 60 to 90 feet. But other than the crystals, the valleys were barren. We scanned over to a wild mountainous region with more extensive forests of larger trees than we had seen before, which resembled our forest oak, but with more superb foliage, with trusses of yellow flowers hung from the branches to the ground. And beyond this forest, we finally saw continuous herds of brown quadrupeds, having all of the external characteristics of the bison, but more diminutive than any of our species. Its tail is like that of our domestic yak, but in its semicircular horns, the hump on its shoulders, the length of its shaggy hair, and the depth of its dewlap, the flesh that hangs beneath the lower jaw, it closely resembled the bison. It had, however, one widely distinctive feature, which we afterwards found common to nearly every lunar quadruped we have discovered, namely, a remarkable fleshy appendage over the eyes, crossing the whole breadth of the forehead and united to the ears. We could most distinctly perceive this hairy veil lifted and lowered by means of the ears, possibly to protect the eyes of the animal from the extremes of light and darkness to which all the inhabitants of our side of the moon are periodically subjected. The next animal we saw would be classed on Earth as a monster. It was of a bluish lead color, about the size of a goat, with a head and beard like a goat and a single horn, slightly inclined forward from the perpendicular. The female was destitute of horn and beard, but had a much longer tail. In elegance of symmetry, it rivaled the antelope, and like him, it seemed an agile, sprightly creature, running with great speed and springing from the green turf with all of the unaccountable antics of a young lamb or kitten. On examining the center of this delightful valley, we found a large branching river, abounding with lovely islands and water birds of numerous kinds. A species of gray pelican was the most numerous, but a black and white crane with unreasonably long legs and bill were also quite common. We also saw a strange, amphibious creature of a spherical form, which rolled with great velocity across the pebbly beach. We named this valley the Valley of the Unicorn. Okay, quick pause. I'm sorry, I didn't want to pause and put my own commentary in here, but the idea of a round frog just rolling across a beach just absolutely kills me. Okay. All right. Whew. We named this valley the Valley of the Unicorn. A few nights later, when conditions were better for viewing the moon, we focused on a chain of mountains with a volcano. The surrounding land is fertile to excess. We counted no less than 12 luxuriant forests, divided by open plains, similar to the prairies of North America. In 3 of these, we discovered numerous herds of quadrupeds, similar to our friends the bisons in the Valley of the Unicorn, but of much larger size, and everywhere we looked, we saw flocks of white or red birds in the air. Dr. Herschel has classified not less than 38 species of forest trees, and nearly twice this number of plants. Of animals, he classified 9 species of mammalia, 5 of ovipara, animals that reproduce by laying eggs. Among the former is a kind of reindeer, the elk, the moose, the horned bear, and the bipedal beaver. The last resembles the beaver of the earth in every other respect than in its destitution of a tail, and its invariable habit of walking upon only 2 feet. It carries its young in its arms like a human being, and moves with an easy, gliding motion. Its huts are constructed better and higher than those of many tribes of ancient humans, and from the appearance of smoke in nearly all of them, there is no doubt that it can use fire. 30 degrees farther south, we noticed a lunar palm tree, which differs from ours only because of its very large crimson flowers, but we saw no fruit on it. On a curious kind of tree melon, we nevertheless saw fruit in great abundance, and in every stage of inception and maturity. Of animals here, we saw only an elegant striped quadruped about 3 feet high, like a miniature zebra, which was always in small herds on the green sward of the hills, and 2 or 3 kinds of long-tailed birds, which we judged to be golden and blue pheasants. Elsewhere, in other red mountains similar to those of the Valley of the Unicorn, we saw a quadruped with an amazingly long neck, head like a sheep, bearing 2 long spiral horns, white as polished ivory. Its body was like that of a deer, but its forelegs were most disproportionately long, and its tail, which was very busy and of a snowy whiteness, curled high over its rump and hung 2 or 3 feet by its side. A few minutes later, we saw 3 specimens of another animal so well known to us all that we fairly laughed at the recognition of so familiar an acquaintance in so distant a land. There were neither more or less than 3 good, large sheep. We could find no mark of distinction between these and those of our native soil. They had not even the appendage over the eyes, which I have described as common to lunar quadrupeds. Presently, they appeared in great numbers, and on reducing the lenses, we found them in flocks over a great part of the valley. There was no shepherd. They fed in peace, lords of their own pastures, without either protector or destroyer in human shape. Beyond this field, where the valley narrowed to 1 mile in width, we saw creatures walking on 2 legs towards a small wood. And certainly, they were like human beings. They averaged 4 feet in height, were covered, except on the face, with a short and glossy copper-colored hair, and had wings composed of a thin membrane similar to our bat, but without hair, lying snugly upon their backs, from the top of their shoulders down to the calves of their legs. The face, which was of a yellowish flesh color, was a slight improvement upon that of the large orangutan on our world. The mouth, however, was very prominent, with a thick beard upon the lower jaw and very human-looking lips. The hair on the head was a darker color than that of the body, closely curled, arranged in 2 curious semicircles over the temples. We saw these creatures engaged in conversation. Their gesticulation, more particularly the varied action of their hands and arms, appeared impassioned and empathetic. They appeared capable of producing works of art. We scientifically denominated them as Vespertilio homo, or man-bat. Sorry, that one always gets me too. Woo, back to it. In another valley, with flaming mountains and marble or crystal hills, we saw a magnificent work of art. It was a temple. It was built of polished sapphire, or some other resplendent blue stone, which displayed a myriad points of golden light twinkling and scintillating in the sunbeams. The roof was composed of some yellow metal. The building had no side walls, but 6 columns on each side, and seemed to contain neither seats, altars, nor offerings. But it was a light and airy structure, nearly 100 feet high from its white glistening floor to its glowing roof. We afterwards discovered 2 others, which were in every respect facsimiles of this one, but in neither did we perceive any visitors besides flocks of wild doves. Had the devotees of these temples gone the way of all living, or were the latter merely historical monuments? We named this area the Vale of the Triads. Immediately on the outer border of the wood which surrounded it, at a distance of half a mile, the eminence on which the first of these temples stood, we saw several detached assemblies of beings whom we instantly recognized to be of the same species as our winged friends, the man-bats. We found that nearly all of the species in these groups were of larger stature than the former specimens. They seemed eminently happy and even polite, for we saw them share fruit. While thus engaged in their rural banquets or in social converse, they were always seated with their knees flat upon the turf and their feet brought evenly together in the form of a triangle. We found that every group or social circle arranged itself in this shape before it dispersed, which was generally done at the signal of an individual who stepped into the center and brought his hands over his head in an acute angle. But this was not the only proof we had that they were creatures of order and subordination. We had no opportunity of seeing them actually engaged in any work of industry or art, and so far as we could judge, they spent their happy hours in collecting various fruits in the woods, in eating, flying, bathing, and loitering around on the summits of precipices. But although evidently the highest order of animals in this rich valley, they were not its only occupants. Most of the other animals which we had discovered elsewhere in very distant regions were collected here, and also at least 8 or 9 new species of quadrupeds. The most attractive of these was a tall white stag, with lofty spreading antlers, black as ebony. We several times saw this elegant creature trot up to the seated parties of the semi-human beings I have described and browse the herbage close behind them, without the least manifestation of fear. The universal state of amity among all classes of lunar creatures, and the apparent absence of every carnivorous or ferocious creatures, doubly endeared to us this lovely nocturnal companion of our larger, but less favored world. And I'm gonna end the recreation there.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hey, baby boomers. This is John Ward. I'm the host of the podcast Baby Boomers, The Strangest Generation. This is not about hula hoops, banana bikes, or the Partridge Family. It's real, it's raw. It's about growing up in the 70s, drugs, fights, ethnicity, long hair. Give it a listen. Baby Boomers, The Strangest Generation. You won't be disappointed, and it is funny as heck. John Ward, Baby Boomers, The Strangest Generation. Thank you.
There is a lot to unpack there. But what strikes me the most, other than the rolling frog balls, the beavers that stand on 2 legs with no tails and have homes with fire, and, man-bat, what strikes me is about how detailed the whole thing is. And again, I just gave you a very short recreation of the main points. The original document is so detailed. It goes into so much depth to make it seem scientific, and I can see why it might have caused an uproar. Perhaps in the same way as the 1938 War of the Worlds broadcast, and how that fooled some people into thinking we were really being invaded by Martians because of how it started as this breaking news report and eyewitness accounts. But at least in the opening of War of the Worlds, there was a disclaimer that said it was fiction. It didn't help people who tuned into the broadcast late, but still. This 6-day newspaper saga was presented as fact, and there were some cool illustrations made of all of those creatures too, in later broadcasts and publications and all kinds of things. You should check them out, they're pretty cool. So, now that we know more or less what was presented to the public, let's dive a little deeper into the history of all of this. And the first thing I want to know is how the public reacted to it. So when I first read this thing, I wanted to know if this was the kind of thing that was completely out of left field. Were there other stories like this about astronomy and science and all that available to the public? According to Kirsten van der Veen of the Smithsonian's Dibner Library, science was this accessible to the common folk, and stories about scientific discoveries and expeditions often made the local newspapers. Okay, so I guess that answers that question. It was not out of the realm of possibility that a story about a discovery of life on the moon would make a local New York newspaper like The Sun. Got it. But its initial publication was so captivating and interesting and frankly weird, and assumed by many as fact that it quickly spread to other newspapers. And it wasn't even just casual readers who were taken in by this fictionalized story. Apparently, even a group of Yale scientists went on a hunt to try to find the original articles and do their own research on the discoveries. Now, part of the reason this story in particular took off was because it coincided with the rise of penny press newspapers. Mass-produced, cheap reads that were sold for a penny, hence the name. The Sun was the first of these penny press publications, and it was significantly cheaper than the normal newspapers, which cost about 6 pennies, 6 cents. For reference, an unskilled laborer in the US in 1833, when the Sun was first founded, was making anywhere from 50 cents to $1 a day. And I get it, you're probably thinking that 6 cents for a newspaper isn't that expensive, but who would pay anywhere from 6 to 12% of their daily income for a newspaper? And besides, that's not even the issue. Many newspapers required upfront yearly subscriptions, so you're not paying 6 cents a day, you're really paying $10 to $12 a year, which you could imagine was a lot harder to justify for many workers, especially when you have a family, you gotta put food on the table and pay rent, and it's not like there were a lot of worker protections in the early 19th century, right? Anyway, penny press newspapers made reading, the news, and stories more accessible by dropping that price down to 1 penny. And if we broaden that history even further, we can look at the impact of technology on this whole process. Because penny press newspapers were mass-printed by steam-powered printing presses, invented in 1814 by Friedrich Koenig and Andreas Bauer. Like with the OG printing press, which by the way was Chinese block printing, which became movable type, which was later co-opted by the Europeans and Johann Gutenberg into what we call the printing press, the steam-powered version of this made the whole process even faster. Now, printing could be done cheaper and faster, churning out significantly more content. For example, the Times of London became the first newspaper to use steam-powered printing presses in 1814, and by automating the process, they managed to print over 1,000 single-sided leaflets per hour, which was 4 times more than what they were making with manually operated printing presses. So if we look at all of this together, interesting information about new discoveries and adventures made cheap and mass-produced, no wonder the penny press newspapers and stories like Herschel's moon discovery took off. And according to one article I read, quote, "From the day the first moon hoax article was released, sales of the paper shot up considerably." End quote. I bet they did. In 1856, so 21 years later, a book came out called The Moon Hoax, or The Discovery that the Moon Has a Vast Population of Human Beings. It was a reprint of the 6 stories into 1 volume, but with an introduction. And in that introduction, the publisher wrote the following, quote, "It appears to be as natural for the human mind to be craving after the wonderful, the mysterious, the marvelous, and the new discoveries as it is for the physical appetite to desire food, drink, and sleep. The key to the popularity of these charming stories which fascinate us is by letting us into the supposed mysteries of an enchanting fairy land, with a grace of narrative that takes us captive, while our curiosity and wonder is raised to the highest pitch in watching the developments unfolded in the narratives of these authors, and quite impatient till we learn the results of the plot or discovery. Among this class of extraordinary fictitious narratives and supposed discovery may be placed the renowned moon hoax. When it first made its appearance, the interest in the discovery was intense, so much so that the circulation of the paper grew 5-fold. Nor did this multiplied circulation of the paper satisfy the public appetite. 60,000 copies were published in pamphlet form, which were sold off in less than 1 month." End quote. So suffice it to say, the story was immensely popular and did the penny press newspapers a favor. I also have no doubt that these penny press newspapers later led to the yellow journalism of the 1890s. They both share the concept of sensational stories sold to a mass audience. But the lingering question I have is, when did the public find out that it was just a hoax? As it turns out, not that much longer after it was published. The first article of the 6 dropped on August 25th, 1835, and not even a month later, on September 16th, the Sun admitted that the series of articles were not real. It was just fictionalized. The author was not John Herschel, it wasn't his partner Dr. Grant or anybody else who was there, but a Cambridge-educated reporter named Richard Adams Locke. Okay, so why did Locke write this very convincing series of articles? What was the point of them, and why that particular moment in time? Well, according to Locke, it was just satire, and it was done as a direct result of a man named Thomas Dick, the Reverend Thomas Dick. As it turns out, Locke's moon story was not the first popular claim that there was life on the moon. Reverend Thomas Dick was a Scottish astronomer and minister who combined his love of science and faith together. And for those of you who may be skeptical of that, he certainly wasn't the first to do it. The idea of combining faith and science goes back a long way in history. St. Augustine, for example, argued back in the 4th century that faith and reason must work together. Then you've got St. Thomas Aquinas, who did the same thing, combining Christian theology with philosophy in the Middle Ages, trying to use the latter to prove the former. And many of our scientific revolution heroes were very religious. Francis Bacon, best known for creating the scientific method, viewed science as an extension of God's will over nature. But anyways, back to our Scottish Reverend. The Reverend believed in the plurality of worlds theory, or pluralism, the idea that since there is an infinite number of atoms, and the universe itself is infinite, it's highly likely that there are other worlds out there like ours, right? It makes sense. Many people look up into the sky at night, into the endless, vast expanse of our universe, and wonder if we're alone. I mean, I sure have. It just seems so improbable that we're the only planet in the entire universe with intelligent life on it. Reverend Dick thought so too. The Reverend wrote several works with his ideas on the moon in particular and extraterrestrial life out there in the universe. He theorized about how the moon has an atmosphere and volcanoes and tropical plant life. He once even calculated the population of the solar system to be at around 21 trillion people. So if stories like that were making the headlines, I could see why Locke wanted to both capitalize on the popularity of the far-fetched, while also poking fun at the nonsense of it all. Many of these stories, Reverend Dick's included, were based on no science or observational data whatsoever. So, doing the same, Locke published what would later become the Moon Hoax in 1835 as a commentary on all of that. But the problem was that at the time, few actually saw it for the commentary that it was, and just believed it was another fantastical discovery. So the satire of it all just kind of whoop right over their heads. Here's another question. How did Dr. John Herschel feel about all of this? I mean, he was a real guy, right? He was a real British astronomer. How did he feel about this? I mean, Locke wrote the whole hoax from more or less this guy's perspective, without him knowing. And in today's world, Locke would probably get sued to death for doing so. Well, a few months after the Sun announced that the story was a hoax, Dr. Herschel's wife Margaret wrote in a letter to an aunt that, quote, Have you seen a very clever piece of imagination in an American newspaper giving an account of Herschel's voyage to the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, and of his wonderful lunar discoveries? Birds, beasts, and fishes of a strange shape, landscapes of every coloring, extraordinary scenes of lunar vegetation, and groups of the reasonable inhabitants of the moon with wings at the backs, all pass in review before his and his companions' astonished gaze. The whole description is so well clenched with minute details of workmanship and names of individuals boldly referred to that the New Yorkists were not to be blamed for actually believing it. It's only a great pity that it was not true. End quote. She seemed to find the whole thing interesting. Herschel himself, though, was less than pleased. He wrote in a letter to the same aunt, quote, really short one, I have been pestered from all quarters with that ridiculous hoax about the moon, in English, French, Italian, and German. End quote. So while the story itself was clearly just a fictionalized adventure tale, it's an interesting look back into our history of popularized media. It shows us the power of technology in mass-producing literature. Tech makes things cheaper and more broadly accessible to your average reader, but as a result, it also changes the type of content available. The more interesting and money-making content will take center stage, regardless of its truth. And it's a lesson that we can apply to today's world as well. When something sounds too fantastical to be true, It probably is. Locke at the Sun was just poking fun of the nonsense of the times, using satire and what he probably thought was clearly nonsense to make fun of those like Reverend Dick, who, without any data or evidence to back it up, claims there was life on the moon. But instead of just poking fun at what he considered to be obvious nonsense, it instead fueled more speculation and uproar about life on the moon, so much so that he had to come out and say that it wasn't real. And this was 191 years ago. And we still fall for nonsense like this today. I guess, like always, make sure you employ healthy skepticism to the nonsense you read online, and try to corroborate any claims with actual evidence and research, because we don't want to all fall for yet another Great Moon Hoax. Thanks for joining me for this episode of A Popular History of Unpopular Things. My name is Kelli Beard, and I hope you've enjoyed this episode on the Great Moon Hoax. Thank you for tuning into my podcast, and check out some of the other episodes if you want more. If you want to support the show, I've got a link in the description for Buy Me a Coffee, a site where fans can fund small creators like me, but without having to sign up for an account if you don't want to. I would of course appreciate any help you can give me, but honestly, I just appreciate that you sit here and listen to me talk about cool history stuff. Be sure to like and follow my podcast, available wherever you listen so you know when new episodes are dropped. And stay tuned to get a popular history of unpopular things. I still can't get over the round, rolling frog balls.